Who's actually running this? Why Your Habits Will Never Change Until This Does, by Tim Costello. For Carrie, who has always known who was actually running this and loved me anyway. And for every leader who has lain awake at 2 a.m. wondering why it won't change. This book is your answer. About the author. Tim Costello is a certified SOS, subconscious optimization system, delivery partner, clinical hypnotherapist, and executive coach. He is the founder of Costello Leadership, based in Sun City, Arizona. For 12 years, Tim served as a missile technician aboard nuclear submarines in the United States Navy, an experience that shaped his understanding of high stakes performance, systems thinking, and what happens to human beings under sustained pressure. Following his Navy service, Tim spent nearly 2 decades in enterprise technology leadership, working with C-suite executives at some of the world's largest organizations across retail, financial services, and healthcare. He observed repeatedly that the leaders who struggled most were not those who lacked intelligence or capability, but those whose subconscious operating systems were running patterns that no amount of coaching, training, or strategic development could reach. That observation led him to SOS and to the clinical training that made him a certified hypnotherapist and SOS practitioner. Tim works with a selective client base of C-suite executives, founders, and the coaches who serve them. He is a keynote speaker and the author of 4 books, including Built from the Inside, The Neuroscience of Emotional Intelligence for High-Performing Leaders, and Built from Within, Raising Emotionally Intelligent Children and Becoming One Yourself. Both books explore the SOS methodology developed by Ryan Fowler. He lives in Sun City, Arizona with his wife, Carrie. www.costelloleadership.com. Tim at costelloleadership.com. A note on the client narratives. The client narratives throughout this book, including the composite leader I call David, are drawn from more than 150 leaders I have had the privilege of working with over the course of my practice. Names, industries, and identifying details have been changed or combined. No single character represents a single person. The patterns, however, are real, repeated with remarkable consistency across every level of leadership and every sector I have encountered. David is not one person. He is the distillation of many, and that, in my view, makes him more true, not less. Introduction. The question nobody asks. There is a moment that most leaders never forget. It doesn't happen in the boardroom. It doesn't happen during a performance review or a strategic planning retreat. It happens quietly, usually alone, in the car after a difficult conversation, or lying awake at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling when a thought surfaces that you're almost too embarrassed to admit. Why do I keep doing this? You've read the books, you've attended the seminars, you've downloaded the apps, built the morning routines, hired the coaches, and committed, genuinely committed, to doing things differently. And for a while, things are different. The habits hold, the results improve. You feel for a season like you finally cracked the code. And then, almost without noticing, you slip back. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, steadily, with a kind of gravitational pull that no amount of willpower seems to overcome. You find yourself back where you started, or close enough to it that the difference barely matters. The short fuse returns. The avoidance creeps in. The old patterns reassert themselves like a language you never really forgot. Most people, when this happens, blame themselves. They conclude that they lack discipline, that they're not motivated enough, that they need a better system, a better coach, a better book. This is not that book. The problem was never your habits. The problem is who's been running the show before you ever decide to change them. What you're about to read is built on a premise that neuroscience has been quietly confirming for decades, even as the self-help industry continues to look the other way. Your habits are not the source of your behavior. They are the symptom. Beneath every habit, every pattern, every reaction that you can't seem to shake, there is an identity, a deeply encoded operating system. that was written long before you were old enough to have any say in the matter. That identity is what's actually running this. Until it changes, nothing else will. Not permanently. Not at the level that matters. This book is about that identity, how it was formed, why it's so resistant to the approaches most of us have tried, and, most importantly, how it actually changes at the neurological level where change has to happen if it's going to last. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I'm not a theorist. I spent 12 years in the United States Navy as a missile technician aboard nuclear submarines, where the cost of getting it wrong wasn't a missed quarterly target, it was catastrophic and irreversible. I learned early that understanding a system is not the same as being able to operate it, and that the most dangerous assumption any leader can make is that they're the one in control. After the Navy, I spent years in enterprise technology leadership, sitting across the table from C suite executives at some of the world's largest companies, watching brilliant, accomplished people make the same self limiting choices at $500,000 a year that they'd been making at $50,000 a year. The title changed, the salary changed, the identity didn't. It wasn't until I discovered the work of Ryan Fowler and became a certified practitioner of the subconscious optimization system, SOS, that I understood why, and more importantly, what to do about it. The pages that follow are the clearest explanation I know how to give of what's actually happening beneath the surface of every leader who has tried to change and wondered why it didn't stick. Some of it will feel uncomfortable, some of it will feel like a relief. My hope is that most of it will feel true, in that particular way that things feel true when they've been true for a long time, and you're just now hearing someone say it out loud. So let's start with the only question that matters. Who's actually running this? Part 1. The operator. Who's been making your decisions before you walk in the room? Chapter 1. The one in charge. In the submarine service, we had a saying that doesn't make it into leadership books very often because it's not the kind of thing that looks good on a motivational poster. The boat doesn't care what you think you know. A nuclear submarine is one of the most complex machines ever built by human hands. It operates in an environment that is hostile to human life in every conceivable way. And it functions when it functions well, because every system aboard knows its role, executes without hesitation, and does not wait for conscious instruction to do what it was designed to do. The most important systems on a submarine are not the ones the captain controls in the moment. They are the ones that were engineered, tested, and calibrated long before the boat ever left port. They run in the background. They maintain pressure, temperature, and atmosphere. They keep the crew alive while the crew is focused on everything else. Your mind works the same way. Neuroscientists estimate that somewhere between 90 and 95% of human behavior is driven not by conscious decision making, but by subconscious processing, automatic programs running beneath the threshold of awareness, executing patterns that were established long before you had the vocabulary to describe them, let alone the wisdom to question them. Dr. Bruce Lipton, whose research on cellular biology and the subconscious mind has influenced a generation of practitioners, puts it plainly. The subconscious mind is a million times more powerful than the conscious mind, and we operate almost entirely from the subconscious. A million times more powerful. Let that land for a moment. When you walk into a difficult conversation with a direct report, it is not your conscious intention that determines how you show up. It is the program. When you avoid a confrontation you know you should have, or push harder than the situation requires, or find yourself inexplicably triggered by something that logically shouldn't bother you, that's not a character flaw. That's the operator doing what operators do, running the show from below. Leadership development that ignores the operator is like upgrading the dashboard on a car with a failing engine. It looks better, it doesn't run better. Meet the operator. I want to give this subconscious identity a name because naming things matters. For the rest of this book, I'll call it the operator. The operator is not your enemy. It's important to understand that from the start. The operator was built to protect you. It was constructed piece by piece, year by year, beginning in the earliest experiences of your life as a response to the environment you were born into. It learned what was safe and what wasn't. It learned how to get love, how to avoid pain, how to survive in the specific family system and social context that shaped you. The operator is extraordinarily good at its job. The problem is that the job it was built for no longer exists. The boardroom is not your childhood kitchen. Your executive team is not your family of origin. The threats your operator was designed to handle, the emotional, relational, and psychological dangers of early life, are not the threats you face as a leader. But the operator doesn't know that. It can't know that because it doesn't update the way a software system does. It doesn't receive patches. It runs the code it was given in the context it now inhabits, regardless of whether that code is still appropriate. This is why intelligent people make repeatedly unintelligent choices. This is why capable leaders plateau. This is why the executive who can articulate a brilliant strategic vision in a Monday morning meeting will, by Thursday afternoon, be managing his team the same way his father managed the household, whether his father was a tyrant or a ghost or somewhere in between. The operator isn't responding to what's happening now, it's responding to a map that was drawn decades ago. The evidence is already there. Here's what I've found across years of working with leaders at every level: the operator's presence isn't subtle. Once you know what to look for, it's everywhere. It's in the pattern of relationships, the types of people a leader consistently attracts, the dynamics that seem to follow them from organization to organization, the conflicts that repeat with different characters but the same essential plot. It's in the body, the tension that arrives before a certain kind of conversation, the exhaustion that follows specific types of interactions, the way certain environments produce a clarity and aliveness, and others produce a low grade dread that never quite resolves. It's in the results, not the results of any single quarter, but the cumulative shape of a leader's career, the ceiling they keep bumping against, the opportunities they consistently underestimate, the ones they consistently oversell. Your results are not random, they are a readout, and what they're reading out is the programming of the operator. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, in his landmark work on trauma and the body, demonstrated that our most formative experiences are not stored as memories in the way we typically think of memories. They are stored as physical and neurological states, as patterns of activation and inhibition that shape how we perceive and respond to the present moment. The operator doesn't just live in your thoughts, it lives in your nervous system, your posture, your breathing, your reflexes. This is why thinking your way out has never worked, and why, if you've tried and failed to change a pattern through insight alone, you haven't failed because you're weak. You've failed because you were using the wrong tool. The question behind the question. When leaders come to me, usually after they've tried everything else, they arrive with surface questions. How do I stop micromanaging? How do I have harder conversations? How do I get out of my own way? These are real questions, but they're not the right question. They're all variations of the same question dressed in different clothes. And that question is, how do I get the operator to run different code? That is the right question, and it has an answer. But before we get to the answer, we need to understand how the operator was built, because you cannot rewrite a program you don't understand, and you cannot understand a program you've never been formally introduced to. So let me introduce you. The one who's been running all of this, for all of this time, is about to step into the light. Chapter 2. Written before you were ready. Nobody chooses their first operating system. That's the part nobody tells you. Not in the leadership books, not in the psychology courses, not in the executive coaching sessions where someone charges $500 an hour to help you optimize a machine whose original programming they never think to examine. The conversation almost always begins too late, at the level of behavior, of habit, of conscious choice, without ever asking the prior question, where did the chooser come from? You were not born with a fixed identity. You were born with a nervous system designed to absorb the environment around you and construct, from that environment, a working model of the world. That model told you who you were, how safe the world was, what you needed to do to belong, and what happened when you didn't. It was built from the raw materials available to you: the emotional climate of your family, the consistency or chaos of early caregiving, the moments of connection and the moments of rupture, the things that were said and the things that were never said but understood completely. By the time you were 7 years old, the core architecture was largely in place. Not finished, the operator continues to accumulate data throughout adolescence and early adulthood. But the foundation, the deep structural code that would govern how you relate to authority, how you handle conflict, how much success you believe you deserve, how you respond when you feel unseen or threatened or overwhelmed, all of that was established before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate it, challenge it, or choose something different. You were written before you were ready to be the author. The child doesn't choose the schema chooses the child, and then spends the rest of its life defending that choice. How the writing happens. To understand how the operator gets its programming, it helps to understand what researchers call schema formation, the process by which early experiences become organized into stable, self reinforcing belief structures about the self and the world. Dr. Jeffrey Young, whose schema therapy model has influenced clinical psychology for decades, identified 18 core schemas that develop in childhood. Patterns like abandonment, defectiveness, subjugation, unrelenting standards, and entitlement, each one a coherent, internally consistent story that the child constructed to make sense of their experience. The story isn't random, it's rational, given what the child had to work with. If love was conditional, the schema says, I must perform to be loved. If vulnerability was punished, the schema says, showing weakness is dangerous. If chaos was the norm, the schema says, I must control everything or everything falls apart. These aren't conclusions the child consciously reaches. They are absorbed, encoded at the level of felt experience, stored in the body and the nervous system long before the prefrontal cortex has developed enough to think critically about them. This is why they're so durable. They weren't formed through logic, and they cannot be dissolved through logic. They were formed through experience, and only experience, the right kind, in the right conditions, can rewrite them. But here's what makes this relevant to every leader reading this book. You didn't leave these schemas at the door when you took your first management role. You brought them with you. You bring them into every room you walk into, every decision you make, every relationship you navigate at work. The schema that says, I am only as valuable as my last result, drives the leader who can never delegate, because delegation feels like exposure. The schema that says conflict means abandonment drives the leader who avoids hard conversations until the situation has deteriorated beyond repair. The schema that says I must be the smartest person in the room drives the leader who unconsciously undermines the people who threaten that position. And these are not personality traits, they are survival strategies that have outlived the threat they were built to address: the submarine and the shore. I want to offer you an image that has stayed with me since my years in the Navy, one that I think captures this dynamic better than any clinical language I've encountered. When a submarine returns from a long deployment, the crew doesn't step off the boat and immediately integrate back into civilian life. There is a decompression process, not just physical, but psychological, because the skills that kept you alive and effective at depth are not always the skills that serve you on shore. The hypervigilance that makes you an exceptional watchstander in a threat environment can make you an exhausting partner at a dinner table. The command hierarchy that provides clarity and safety underwater can make you autocratic and inflexible in a collaborative team setting. The compression of emotion required to function in crisis conditions can, over time, make genuine intimacy feel foreign and faintly dangerous. The boat built you for the boat, and then you had to live somewhere else. Your childhood did the same thing. It built an operator calibrated for a specific environment. your family system, your early social world, the particular emotional and relational terrain of your first decade of life. That operator is extraordinarily well suited to navigate the world it was built for. The problem is that world no longer exists. You are living somewhere else now, leading somewhere else, and the operator is still running protocols for a mission that ended years ago. The most common leadership problem I encounter isn't a lack of skill. It's a highly skilled operator running the wrong mission. What gets locked in? Research in developmental neuroscience has given us an increasingly precise picture of what early experience actually does to the brain and nervous system. And the picture is both more hopeful and more sobering than most people realize. The hopeful part: the brain is far more plastic than we once believed. The discovery of neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself, form new connections, and modify existing ones, fundamentally changed what we thought was possible in terms of human change and development. The operator is not permanent, it is not destiny. The sobering part: neuroplasticity does not operate on the timeline most personal development programs assume. Reading a book, attending a seminar, or committing to a new habit does not, by itself, reach the level of encoding where the operator lives. The subconscious patterns that drive behavior are stored at a depth that conscious intention simply cannot access through the front door. They require a different approach, one that speaks the language of the nervous system, not the language of the intellect. Stephen Porges, whose polyvagal theory has transformed our understanding of how the autonomic nervous system governs human behavior, demonstrated that our most fundamental responses to safety and threat, the ones that underlie all social engagement, all connection, all leadership behavior, are regulated below the level of conscious thought. These are not responses we choose. They are responses that choose us based on how our nervous system learned to read the world in the earliest years of our lives. Gabor Mate, in his work on the relationship between early experience and adult health, goes further. The patterns laid down in childhood don't just shape our psychology, they shape our physiology, our immune function, our hormonal systems, our relationship to our own bodies. All of it carries the imprint of what happened before we were old enough to remember it consciously. This is not meant to be discouraging. It is meant to be clarifying, because the leaders I work with who make the deepest, most durable changes are not the ones who try harder. They are the ones who finally understand what they're actually dealing with and then use the right tool for the job. The author you didn't know you had. Here's the question I ask every leader I work with, usually in the first session, after we've established enough trust that the answer can be honest. If you could trace the pattern you most want to change back to its origin, back to the moment or the environment that first made it make sense, what would you find? The answers vary in their specifics. They always share a common structure: a child doing the best they could with what they had, constructing a strategy for survival that worked in the moment and became a prison over time. The father who withheld approval until the performance was perfect, and the executive who can't celebrate a win before moving to the next problem. The mother whose emotional volatility made the household unpredictable, and the leader who overcontrols every variable in the environment because uncertainty feels, at the level of the nervous system, like danger. The family system where needs were dismissed as weakness, and the CEO who hasn't asked for help in 15 years. None of these leaders are broken. None of them are lacking in intelligence or capability or drive. They are operating from a set of instructions that made perfect sense when they were written. The instructions just haven't been updated. The good news, and I mean this in the most literal neurological sense of the phrase, is that instructions can be rewritten. But first, we need to understand why everything you've tried so far hasn't done it. Because it's not for lack of effort. It's not for lack of information. It's because most of what passes for personal development never reaches the level where the operator actually lives. That's where we're going next. Chapter 3: Why Smart People Stay Stuck. I want to tell you about a man I'll call David. David was 51 years old when we first spoke. He had built a regional logistics company from 11 employees to just under 400 over the course of 2 decades. He had survived 2 recessions, a partnership dissolution that nearly cost him everything, and a health scare at 46 that he described without drama as the thing that finally made him take his life seriously. He was, by any reasonable measure, a success story. He was also, by his own admission, exhausting to work for. His leadership team walked on eggshells. His COO, a woman of exceptional competence who had been with the company for 9 years, had submitted her resignation twice and been talked back both times. His adult children kept a careful distance. His second marriage was, in his words, functional, which, delivered the way he delivered it, was clearly not a compliment. David had read everything, and I mean that without exaggeration. He had annotated copies of Good to Great, Extreme Ownership, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team, Atomic Habits, and at least a dozen others stacked on the credenza behind his desk. He had worked with 2 executive coaches before me. He had completed a 360-degree feedback assessment that returned results so consistent, so unanimously pointing in the same direction that even David couldn't rationalize them away. He knew exactly what he was doing wrong. He could describe it with clinical precision, and he kept doing it anyway. When I asked him what had brought him to me specifically after all of that, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I've heard, in one form or another, from nearly every leader I've worked with at this level. I understand the problem perfectly. I just can't seem to get below it. Understanding the pattern is not the same as changing it. Insight is the map, it is not the territory, the intelligence trap. There's a particular kind of suffering that belongs almost exclusively to intelligent, self aware people, and it is this: they can see themselves clearly enough to know exactly what they're doing, and not clearly enough to understand why they can't stop. This creates a secondary wound on top of the primary one. Not only is the pattern persisting, the pattern is persisting in someone who knows better, and knowing better without being able to do better produces a specific flavor of shame that is exceptionally corrosive to leadership identity. I've sat across from CEOs who have built 9 figure companies and watched them lower their voices when they described a pattern of behavior that would barely register in a first-year psychology textbook, not because the pattern was shameful, but because they believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that a person of their intelligence and accomplishment should be able to simply decide to be different. They are wrong, and the wrongness of that belief is costing them more than they know. Intelligence is a front brain capacity. It lives in the prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning, analysis, reasoning, and conscious decision making. It is exquisitely good at solving problems that can be solved through logic. It is almost entirely useless against problems that don't live in the logical mind. The operator doesn't live in the prefrontal cortex. It lives deeper in the limbic system, in the brainstem, in the encoded somatic patterns of the nervous system. These are structures that were ancient long before language existed, long before the capacity for abstract reasoning evolved. They do not respond to argument. They do not update based on information. They respond to experience, to felt safety, to the slow renegotiation of what the nervous system believes to be true about the world. Trying to think your way out of a subconscious pattern is like trying to negotiate with a smoke detector. The detector doesn't care about your reasoning, it's responding to what it was built to detect. Until the underlying condition changes, the alarm keeps sounding. Why willpower always loses. The second tool most people reach for after insight fails is willpower. And willpower works, up to a point for a period of time, under conditions that are not too demanding. The problem is that willpower is a finite resource drawn from a well that depletes throughout the day, under stress, in the presence of ambiguity, and in exactly the kinds of high stakes interpersonal situations where leadership most requires consistency. Roy Baumeister's research on ego depletion demonstrated what most leaders already know intuitively. The harder you're working to control one area of behavior, the less capacity you have to control another. And the operator doesn't deplete, it doesn't get tired, it doesn't take the afternoon off because the quarterly close was brutal or because the board meeting ran 3 hours. The operator is always running, always available, always ready to take the wheel the moment conscious control relaxes its grip. This is not a fair fight. It was never meant to be a fair fight. The operator evolved over millions of years to be faster, more automatic, and more energetically efficient than conscious deliberation. Willpower is a relatively recent cognitive innovation trying to override a system that is orders of magnitude older and more deeply embedded. The leaders who rely most heavily on willpower are often the ones who are paradoxically most at risk because sustained willpower creates pressure, and pressure in a system with an unaddressed operator doesn't disappear. It accumulates, it compresses, and then it releases, usually at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible context, in ways that confirm every fear the leader had about themselves. The explosion in the leadership team meeting, the email sent at midnight that couldn't be unsent, the decision made in a moment of frustration that took 18 months to repair. These are not failures of character. They are the predictable output of a system running on willpower fumes while the operator waits patiently in the background. Willpower is a sprinter trying to win a marathon against a competitor who never gets tired. The outcome was never in question. Why the Habit Loop Has Limits. James Clear wrote one of the most useful books of the last decade in atomic habits. I mean that without qualification. The framework he offers, cue, craving, response, reward, is elegant, actionable, and genuinely helpful for a category of behavioral change that lives at the surface level of human functioning. The key word there is surface. Habits, as Clear defines them, are automatic behaviors that have been encoded through repetition. They are the operator's preferred mode of operation, efficient, low energy, consistent. And the techniques Clear offers for building new habits and dismantling old ones work beautifully when the habit in question is not load bearing. A load bearing habit is one that is serving a deeper psychological function, one that is not merely a pattern of behavior, but a behavioral expression of a schema. These habits don't just feel automatic, they feel necessary. They carry an emotional charge that pure habit formation never touches. And when you try to remove them without addressing what they're actually doing, the system resists in ways that feel irrational precisely because the resistance is coming from a part of the mind that doesn't operate through reason. Clear himself acknowledges in the deeper sections of his work that identity underlies habit. He argues that the most effective way to change behavior is to change the identity from which the behavior flows, to become the kind of person who does the thing rather than merely trying to do the thing. This is correct. It is the right diagnosis. What Atomic Habits doesn't fully address, what it can't address because it isn't a clinical text, is how identity actually changes at the neurological level. How do you become a different kind of person when the operator is actively working to preserve the current one? How do you rewrite the identity when the identity is the thing doing the writing? That is the question this book is built to answer. The ceiling is not a ceiling. Back to David. After our third session together, something shifted, not in his behavior, not yet, but in his understanding of what was actually happening. He stopped describing his pattern as a character flaw and started describing it as a system output. He stopped asking why he couldn't change and started asking what the pattern was actually protecting. That is the question that opens the door. Because every persistent pattern, every behavior that survives insight, survives willpower, survives habit formation, survives coaching, is protecting something. It was built to protect something. And until you understand what that is, dismantling the pattern feels to the nervous system like dismantling a load bearing wall. What David eventually discovered through the kind of deep, embodied process that we'll explore in part 3 was that his controlling, demanding leadership style was the adult expression of a child who had learned that chaos was the default state of the world and that the only way to prevent disaster was to control every variable within reach. His father had been an alcoholic. The household had been unpredictable, and David, at 5 years old, had concluded, not in words, but in felt experience, that if he could just manage everything tightly enough, he could keep the worst from happening. He had been doing it ever since, with employees, with children, with partners, with every room he walked into where the outcome mattered. The ceiling David kept bumping against wasn't a ceiling, it was a wall he had built himself out of materials sourced in a childhood home he hadn't lived in for 45 years. And no amount of reading, no number of coaching sessions, no habit stack in the world was going to take it down because none of those tools reached the place where it was anchored. That place is what we're going to next. And what's waiting there is not what most people expect. Part 2. The evidence. Why your results keep telling you the same story. Chapter 4. The patterns don't lie. There is a particular exercise I conduct with nearly every leader in the first phase of our work together, and it is deceptively simple. I ask them to describe, in as much detail as they're willing to give, the three most significant professional relationships that have gone wrong in their career. Not the ones that ended due to circumstance or organizational change, the ones that deteriorated, that became painful, that left a residue of confusion or regret. And then I ask them to describe, with the same level of detail, the three most significant personal relationships that have followed the same arc. I don't analyze the stories as they tell them, I just listen. I'm not looking for content, I'm looking for structure. Because here is what I have found without exception across years of this work: the structure is always the same. The names change, the industries change, the decades change. The essential dynamic, the role the leader plays, the type of person they attract into that role, the way the conflict escalates, the way it ends, follows a pattern so consistent that by the third story, I can often describe the fourth before they've told it. This is not a parlor trick. It is one of the most important diagnostic tools available to anyone serious about understanding their own operator, because the pattern is not a coincidence, it is a readout. And what it's reading out is the subconscious schema running beneath every choice the leader has made, in every relationship, across every context, for as long as the schema has been active. The patterns don't lie, they never have. Most people just haven't been taught how to read them. Your history is not a sequence of random events. It is a curriculum designed by your operator, taught in every relationship, repeated until the lesson is finally learned. What patterns actually are. A pattern, in the psychological sense, is a behavioral sequence that repeats across different contexts because it is being generated by the same underlying source. It is not a habit in the conventional sense. Habits are context specific, triggered by particular cues in particular environments. Patterns are context independent. They follow you. The leader who consistently finds themselves doing the work of people who report to them across 3 companies, 4 teams, 2 entirely different industries is not having bad luck with underperformers. They are expressing a schema that says, if I want something done right, I have to do it myself. That schema will populate every team they ever lead with the specific dynamic that confirms it, because the schema operates not just on behavior, but on perception. It causes the leader to notice and amplify evidence that confirms the belief while filtering out evidence that would challenge it. This is what psychologists call a self fulfilling prophecy, but that phrase doesn't quite capture the full mechanism. It's not just that the leader behaves in ways that produce the outcome they fear. It's that the schema shapes what the leader perceives, how they interpret ambiguous signals, which team members they promote and which they marginalize, how they structure accountability, how they respond to early signs of competence versus early signs of struggle. The schema doesn't just react to the environment, it constructs the environment. The leader who consistently finds themselves surrounded by people who don't perform is, in many cases, unconsciously selecting for them, unconsciously undermining those who might challenge the schema's authority, and unconsciously creating the conditions under which underperformance becomes inevitable. None of this is conscious. All of it is patterned. The three categories of pattern. In my work with leaders, patterns tend to cluster into three broad categories, each one a different expression of the operator's core programming. The first category is relational patterns, the recurring dynamics in how a leader connects, conflicts, and disconnects from the people around them. These are the most visible patterns, the ones that show up most clearly in 360-degree feedback and that most leadership development programs attempt to address. They include things like the consistent inability to maintain peer relationships without them becoming competitive, the tendency to overinvest in a small number of loyalists while keeping everyone else at arm's length, or the pattern of intense initial engagement with new team members followed by gradual withdrawal when the honeymoon period ends. The second category is performance patterns, the recurring shapes of a leader's professional trajectory. These are subtler, but in some ways more revealing. The leader who consistently reaches a certain level of authority and then self sabotages, not through dramatic failure, but through a series of small decisions that create distance between themselves and the next level. The leader who produces exceptional results in turnaround situations but cannot sustain performance once stability is established. The leader who is brilliant in a support role and consistently disappointing in a seat of primary responsibility. The third category is somatic patterns, the recurring physical and physiological responses that accompany specific types of situations. These are the least discussed and, in my experience, the most diagnostically precise. The constriction in the chest that arrives before a certain kind of conversation, the fatigue that descends after interactions with a particular type of authority figure, the hyper alertness that activates in environments that feel at the nervous system level like a threat, even when the conscious mind can find no rational reason for the response. These three categories are not separate. They are different expressions of the same underlying operator programming, showing up in the domain, relational, professional, somatic, where the schema has the most charge. Reading your own readout. I want to offer you a practical exercise here because this chapter is not meant to be merely descriptive, it is meant to be useful. Take 15 minutes, not right now, but at a time when you have genuine quiet, and answer the following questions as honestly as you can manage, not as you wish the answers were, as they actually are. What is the conflict dynamic that has followed you from role to role? Not the specific content of the conflicts, but the structure, who plays which role, how it escalates, how it resolves or fails to resolve. What is the ceiling you have bumped against most consistently? Not the external circumstances that surrounded it, but the internal experience of approaching it. What you felt, what you told yourself, what you did or didn't do in those moments. What type of person consistently disappoints you? And this is the harder question. What is the role you play in the dynamic that produces that disappointment? What physical sensations do you associate with your most challenging leadership moments? Where do you feel them? When do they arrive? What do they cause you to do? These questions are not comfortable. They are not meant to be. Comfort is the enemy of pattern recognition because the operator is extraordinarily skilled at generating rationalizations that keep the pattern invisible. It explains away the third difficult employee as a hiring mistake. It attributes the fourth relationship rupture to the other person's issues. It files the recurring professional plateau under bad timing or market conditions. The operator is not stupid, it is self-protective. And one of the things it is most protecting is its own continuity. The rationalization is part of the pattern. The story you tell about why it keeps happening is the operator's most sophisticated defense. The readout is not the verdict. I want to be careful here because there is a version of this conversation that becomes its own kind of trap. The point of identifying patterns is not to construct a more elaborate story of limitation. It is not to replace the narrative of I keep failing because I lack discipline with the narrative of I keep failing because my childhood wired me wrong. Both of those narratives, however differently they assign blame, share the same fundamental error. They treat the pattern as the truth about the person rather than information about the system. The pattern is data, that's all it is. Extraordinarily useful data, more useful in many ways than anything a conventional assessment tool can produce, because it has been generated over years by actual behavior in actual conditions. But data is descriptive, not prescriptive. It tells you where you've been. It does not determine where you're going. I have watched leaders in their 50s make changes that their 20 something selves couldn't have imagined. I have watched people who had been told explicitly by therapists and coaches and well meaning family members that they were who they were and the best they could hope for was better management of their damage. I have watched those people rewrite, at the neurological level, patterns that had been active for 4 decades. The pattern is not the person. The operator is not the self. It is a system that was built by experience, and it can be changed by experience. The right kind, delivered at the right level through a process that actually reaches where the programming lives. Understanding that is the prerequisite for everything that follows. Because before we can talk about how to change the operator, we need to understand why the approaches most people have tried haven't reached it, and what the science of memory and the body has to tell us about where it actually lives. That's where we're going in the next 2 chapters. And what you find there may be the most important thing you read in this book. Chapter 5: The Habit Loop. Chapter 5: The habit loop was never the problem. In the spring of 2012, a researcher named Anne Gray Beal at MIT published findings that quietly upended one of the foundational assumptions of behavioral psychology. Her team had been studying the neural activity of rats as they learned to navigate a simple maze, a T-shaped path with a piece of chocolate at one end. In the early trials, the rats' brains were intensely active throughout the run. They were processing, exploring, making decisions in real time. But as the task became familiar, something unexpected happened. The brain activity didn't stabilize across the whole maze. It compressed. The neural firing that had once been distributed across the entire experience collapsed into two sharp spikes, one at the start of the maze, one at the reward. Everything in between went quiet. What Graybeel's team had captured was habit formation at the neurological level. The moment a behavior transitions from effortful conscious decision making to automatic subconscious execution. The brain, always conserving energy, had chunked the entire sequence into a single automated unit. Start cue, run the program, collect the reward. This is the mechanism that James Clear built atomic habits around, and it is real, it is powerful, and it is responsible for a meaningful percentage of human behavior. If you want to understand why you reach for your phone the moment you sit down, why you order the same thing at restaurants you've been to before, or why you take the same route to work even when you know there's construction, habit loops explain it precisely. But here is the thing about the rats in Graybeel's maze that almost never makes it into the habit conversation. The rats were not running the maze because of what happened in childhood. They were not navigating a T-shaped path because a parent withheld love, or because their early environment taught them that uncertainty was dangerous, or because they had constructed an identity around being the kind of rat who always gets to the chocolate first. They were running a learned behavior in response to a conditioned cue. And that is a categorically different thing from what most leaders are dealing with when they talk about the patterns they can't change. A habit is a learned behavior. A schema is an identity. Treating one like the other is the most expensive mistake in personal development. Two levels of automatic. There is a distinction that the popular habit literature consistently collapses, and the collapse is consequential. Habits, as behavioral science defines them, are automatic responses to environmental cues. They are formed through repetition, stored in a region of the brain called the basal ganglia, and executed without significant conscious involvement once they are sufficiently encoded. They are, in the truest sense, learned programs, installed through experience, retrievable through the right trigger, modifiable through the deliberate substitution of new behavior patterns in response to the same cues. Schemas are something different. They are not learned responses to specific cues. They are organizing frameworks, deep cognitive and emotional structures that determine how a person perceives, interprets, and responds to entire categories of experience. A schema is not triggered by a single cue in a specific context. It is active across contexts, shaping perception and behavior at a level that precedes conscious awareness, coloring the meaning assigned to events before the thinking mind has had a chance to weigh in. A habit says, when I sit at my desk in the morning, I check email before I do anything else. A schema says, my value is determined by my productivity, and any moment of unstructured time is a form of failure. The habit can be changed by restructuring the morning environment, removing the phone from the desk, installing a different first behavior, using the architecture of cue and reward to build a new sequence. The schema cannot be changed this way because the schema is not a response to the morning environment. It is a lens through which every morning, every hour, every interaction, every decision is filtered. When you try to change a schema using habit formation techniques, you are not attacking the problem. You are rearranging the furniture in a room whose walls are made of something you haven't touched. The identity layer. James Clear points to. To his credit, James Clear understands this. There is a section of Atomic Habits, one that receives far less attention than the four laws of behavior change, where he describes what he calls identity-based habits. The argument is elegant. The most durable behavioral change comes not from focusing on outcomes or processes, but from changing the belief about who you are. You don't try to run a marathon, you become a runner. You don't try to write every day, you become a writer. The behavior flows from the identity, and so the identity is the lever. This is correct. It is the right diagnosis, and it points directly at the layer where real change has to happen. What the framework doesn't provide, what it can't provide within the scope of a behavioral science book, is a mechanism for how identity actually changes at the neurological level. Clear suggests that identity is built through the accumulation of small behavioral wins. Each time you act like the person you want to become, you cast a vote for that identity, and over time, the votes add up. This is true as far as it goes. Small, consistent actions do shape self-concept over time. But for a leader whose identity has been organized around survival schemas formed in early childhood, schemas that carry the full weight of the nervous system's encoding, that are stored not just as beliefs but as physiological states, that are actively defended by a subconscious system that experiences change as threat, the vote accumulation model is insufficient. It is trying to win an election in a district that has been gerrymandered by the operator. The votes get cast, the operator counts them differently. You cannot vote your way into a new identity when the thing counting the ballots is the identity you're trying to replace. What load-bearing habits actually are. Let me return to a term I introduced in the previous chapter because it deserves more precision than I gave it there. A load-bearing habit is a behavioral pattern that is not merely automatic. It is structural. It is doing a job. That job is psychological. It is managing anxiety, maintaining a sense of control, preserving a self-concept, or avoiding an emotional state that the operator has classified as intolerable. Remove the behavior without addressing the job it is doing, and the system will find another behavior to do the same job, often a worse one. This is why so many leaders who successfully stop one problematic pattern find that another one emerges in its place. The executive who stops the explosive anger and discovers that he has become icily withholding instead. The leader who breaks the pattern of overwork and finds herself managing her anxiety through micromanagement of her team's processes. The founder who stops drinking and starts gambling, or starts eating, or starts working 18-hour days with a fervor that would have seemed excessive even before. These are not failures of willpower or commitment. They are the operator doing its job, preserving the core function of the pattern even as the surface behavior shifts. The pressure has to go somewhere. Until the underlying schema is addressed, it will always find a new outlet. In the clinical world, this is called symptom substitution, and it is the single most reliable indicator that a treatment approach is working at the wrong level. The behavior changed, the source didn't. This is also why the most sophisticated habit formation systems, the ones with the most elegant architecture of cues and rewards and implementation intentions, produce the most frustrating results for leaders dealing with deep pattern issues. The system is well designed. The problem is that it's solving for the wrong variable. What actually has to change? So, if insight doesn't reach the operator, and willpower can't outlast it, and habit formation can't restructure it, what does? The answer, which we will explore in depth in part 3, involves three things that conventional personal development almost never addresses in combination. The first is the memory itself, the specific encoded experience that anchors the schema. Not the conscious narrative about the experience, but the experiential memory, the felt sense, the emotional charge, the physiological state that the brain stored when the original learning happened. This memory is not static. Neuroscience has demonstrated that memories are reconsolidated, literally rewritten at the molecular level every time they are retrieved. That process of reconsolidation is the doorway through which lasting change becomes possible. The second is the nervous system state in which the work happens. Change that happens in a state of activation, anxiety, defensiveness, the low grade threat response that most challenging conversations produce, is change that the nervous system will encode as more threat. The conditions in which the operator was originally written must be understood, and the conditions in which it can be rewritten are specific. They require a depth of safety and openness that most professional development environments never create. The third is the replacement experience, not a new behavior, but a new felt sense of identity. Not telling the nervous system a different story about who you are, but giving the nervous system the actual experience of being someone different. This is the distinction between affirmation and transformation. Affirmation says you are enough. Transformation gives you the felt knowledge of what enough actually feels like from the inside and encodes that feeling at the same depth where the original deficit was stored. These three elements together, memory reconsolidation, regulated nervous system state, and corrective emotional experience, are what the SOS methodology is built around. They are also, not coincidentally, what the leading edge of neuroscience and clinical psychology has been converging on for the last 2 decades. The habit loop was never the problem. It was always a symptom of something that lives much deeper. And in the next chapter, we're going to look directly at where that something lives in the body, in the memory, in the nervous system, and why the science of that location is, for the leaders who discover it, genuinely life changing. Chapter 6: The Body Keeps the Score. Somewhere in your leadership history, there is a room you dread. You may not have named it that. You may describe it as a type of meeting, or a particular kind of conversation, or a specific configuration of people and stakes that reliably produces in you a response you cannot fully explain. The response is not proportional to the situation. You know that. You can see from the outside that what is being asked of you is not actually dangerous, that the stakes, while real, do not warrant the activation that moves through your body when the situation approaches. But the body doesn't consult your assessment of the situation before it responds. It has already rendered its verdict. It delivered it before you finished reading the meeting invite. This is not anxiety in the clinical sense, though it may feel like it. It is not weakness, though the inner critic will call it that. It is the nervous system doing precisely what it was designed to do: scanning the environment for patterns that match stored threat signals, and preparing the organism for response before the conscious mind has had a chance to evaluate whether the threat is real. The body is not wrong, it is just working from an old map. And until we understand that map, where it was drawn, what it was drawn from, and why the body trusts it more than it trusts you, we cannot understand why the operator is so resistant to change through conventional means. The body carries the biography. Every formative experience you have ever had is written somewhere in the physiology, in the posture, the breath, the reflexes, the places where tension lives and never quite leaves. What van der Kolk actually found. In 2014, Bessel van der Kolk published The Body Keeps the Score, a book that did something unusual for a clinical text. It reached a general audience and stayed there because what it described was something that enormous numbers of people recognized immediately and viscerally as true. Van der Kolk's central argument, developed over decades of clinical work with trauma survivors, is this: the most significant impacts of adverse experience are not stored as narrative memories. They are stored as somatic states, as patterns of physiological activation and inhibition that persist in the body long after the original event has passed, and that are triggered not by conscious recollection, but by environmental cues that the nervous system associates with the original threat. This is why a combat veteran can hear a car backfire and be, in every physiological sense, back in the field. Heart rate elevated, muscles tensed, perceptual field narrowed before the conscious mind has had time to register that the sound came from a parking lot in suburban Ohio. The body recognized the pattern. The body responded. The thinking brain arrived late, as it almost always does. But van der Kolk's findings extend far beyond combat trauma, and this is the part that is most relevant to the leaders reading this book. Developmental experiences, the chronic, cumulative, relational experiences of childhood rather than discrete catastrophic events, produce the same kind of somatic encoding at a level that is just as difficult to access through conscious means, but that is often far less visible because it produces not dramatic flashback responses, but subtle, pervasive shifts in how a person inhabits their body and navigates the world. The child who grew up in a household where emotional expression was met with withdrawal learns to hold the breath slightly, to compress the chest, to present a surface of calm that costs enormous amounts of energy to maintain. 20 years later, that leader sits across from a direct report in a difficult conversation, and the body executes the same program: compress, contain, present calm, not because the situation requires it, because the nervous system knows no other response to emotional intensity. The child who grew up where unpredictability was the norm develops a nervous system tuned to high alert, hypervigilant, scanning, never fully at rest. 20 years later, that leader reads threat into ambiguity that doesn't contain it, reacts to minor organizational turbulence as though it signals catastrophe, and exhausts their team with the urgency that the nervous system generates automatically in any situation that lacks complete clarity. The body is not creating these responses in the present. It is replaying responses that were encoded in the past, and it will keep replaying them until the encoding changes. The polyvagal piece. Stephen Porges spent decades developing what he called polyvagal theory, a framework for understanding the autonomic nervous system that has quietly transformed how the most sophisticated clinicians think about human behavior, relationship, and change. The core insight of polyvagal theory is that the autonomic nervous system does not operate on a simple binary of stress and rest. It has three distinct states, each one associated with a different set of behavioral capacities, and each one determining, and below the level of conscious choice, how a person is able to engage with the world in any given moment. The first state is ventral vagal, what Porges calls the social engagement system. This is the state of connection, openness, curiosity, and creativity. It is the state in which genuine learning happens, in which trust is built, in which the full cognitive and emotional resources of the human organism are available. Leaders in this state are present, responsive, generative. They can hear hard feedback without defending. They can sit with uncertainty without controlling. They can be wrong without it threatening their sense of self. The second state is sympathetic activation, the fight or flight response. This is the state of mobilization, heightened alertness, narrowed focus, increased physical readiness. It is appropriate and adaptive in situations of genuine threat. In leadership contexts, it produces the behaviors that 360-degree feedback instruments consistently flag: reactivity, rigidity, difficulty listening, the compulsion to dominate or escape. The third state is dorsal vagal, the freeze or collapse response. This is the state of shutdown, withdrawal, disconnection. In its most extreme form, it produces the dissociation associated with severe trauma. In its milder chronic form, which is far more common in organizational settings than most people realize, it produces the leader who goes through the motions without presence, who sits in meetings without being in them, who has learned to function on autopilot because the alternative feels too exposed. Here is what Porges demonstrated that changes everything. These states are not chosen. They are determined by the neuroception, Porges's term for the nervous system's continuous subconscious scanning of the environment for signals of safety or threat. Neuroception happens faster than conscious perception. It is done before you know it is happening, and it determines which state you enter, which means it determines what you are capable of in that moment. A leader whose nervous system was calibrated in a chronically unsafe early environment will have a neuroceptive system that is set by default to threat detection, not because the leader is paranoid, because the nervous system learned in the most formative period of its development that the world required constant vigilance, and it has been running that program ever since. You cannot think your way into a regulated nervous system. You can only experience your way there, and the experience has to be real enough, sustained enough, and safe enough to update the original encoding. Lipton and the biology of belief. Dr. Bruce Lipton's contribution to this conversation comes from an unexpected direction: cellular biology, and it lands with a force that most people don't anticipate. Lipton's research, conducted originally at Stanford University's School of Medicine, demonstrated that the behavior of cells is not primarily determined by genetics. It is determined by the environment, specifically by the signals the cell receives from its surrounding environment and the way the cell's membrane is programmed to interpret those signals. The implications for human psychology are profound. If the behavior of individual cells is governed not by fixed genetic programming, but by environmental signals filtered through a learned interpretive framework, then the belief systems we develop about ourselves and the world are not merely psychological phenomena, they are biological ones. They shape, at the cellular level, how the organism functions, what it perceives as possible, and how it responds to the conditions it encounters. Lipton argues, and his research supports the argument, that the subconscious programs downloaded in the first 7 years of life operate like the software of a cell membrane. They filter environmental signals, determine what gets through and what doesn't, and shape the organism's behavior in ways that feel automatic because, at the deepest level, they are. The conscious mind in this framework is like a pilot who occasionally takes the controls. The subconscious is the autopilot running the plane the rest of the time. What Lipton adds to van der Kolk and Porges is scale. The operator is not just a psychological construct, it is a biological reality expressed at every level of the organism: in the cells, in the nervous system, in the hormonal and immune systems, in the posture and breathing and facial expression and vocal tone that other people read, often without being fully conscious of it, when they assess whether a leader is someone they can trust. Your biology is broadcasting your operator's programming. Your team is receiving that broadcast. And no amount of strategic communication training will fully override what the body is transmitting at the level of the nervous system. Why this is actually good news. I want to pause here because I am aware that this chapter has been delivering what might feel like an increasingly heavy weight of evidence for how deeply the past is embedded in the present. And I want to be clear that this is not where the story ends. Every researcher cited in this chapter, van der Kolk, Porges, Lipton, arrived at their findings not to declare the human being a prisoner of early experience, but to understand the mechanisms of encoding precisely enough to develop approaches that could actually change it. Van der Kolk spent his career developing and evaluating somatic interventions, body-based therapies that reach the level where the trauma is stored. Porges's polyvagal theory is, at its core, a framework for creating the conditions of safety in which the nervous system can reorganize. Lipton's work points toward the plasticity of belief at the biological level, the capacity for the organism to update its programming when the right conditions are present. The body keeps the score, but the score is not the final result. It is the starting point for a different kind of work, work that doesn't ask you to think differently, or try harder, or build better habits, work that goes directly to where the programming lives and does something that most leaders have been told, in one way or another, was not possible. It rewrites it. And that is what part 3 is about. And after everything we've covered in the first 2 parts of this book, the operator, how it was built, why conventional approaches don't reach it, where it actually lives, you are now ready to understand not just that change is possible, but precisely how it happens. Let's go there. Part 3, the rewrite, how identity actually changes and what that requires. Chapter 7, you can't think your way out. There is a conversation I have had in various forms with hundreds of leaders over the course of my career. It usually begins with some version of the same sentence. I know exactly why I do this. I've known for years, but knowing doesn't seem to help. What follows is always a story of extraordinary effort, journals filled with insight, therapists who helped them understand the origin of the pattern, coaches who gave them frameworks and accountability structures, retreats and assessments and 360s and honest conversations with people who cared enough to tell them the truth. And at the end of all of it, the knowing, the clear, sometimes painfully clear understanding of where the pattern came from, what it costs, and what a different version of themselves might look like. The pattern unchanged. When I tell these leaders that insight is not the problem, that they could, in fact, understand themselves more deeply than they already do and still not change the thing they most want to change, the response is almost always the same: a long pause, and then something that looks like relief, because they have been blaming themselves for the gap between knowing and doing. They have been interpreting that gap as evidence of a character deficiency, a lack of commitment, a weakness of will, a fundamental limitation in who they are. And what I am telling them is that the gap is not a character deficiency, it is an architectural reality. Insight is a front brain phenomenon. It lives in the prefrontal cortex, the same region responsible for planning, analysis, and conscious decision making, and the operator does not live there. It never did. Sending insight to change the operator is like sending a letter to an address where no one has ever lived. The letter is well written, it arrives promptly, no one opens it. Insight is the map of the territory. The territory doesn't change because you drew a better map. The therapy paradox. I want to address something here that requires a degree of care because therapy, good therapy, has genuinely helped enormous numbers of people, and I am not interested in diminishing that. Many of the leaders I work with have done significant therapeutic work, and that work has been valuable. It has reduced suffering, improved relationships, and built capacities that made everything else more possible. But there is a specific limitation in much of what passes for talk-based therapeutic work, and it is this: the medium is the wrong tool for the deepest level of the job. Talk therapy operates primarily in the domain of narrative. The story a person tells about their experience, the meaning they make of it, the reframing and recontextualizing that happens when that story is examined in the presence of a skilled clinician. This is genuinely useful work. Narrative shapes identity. The stories we tell about ourselves determine, to a significant degree, how we move through the world. But the schemas that drive the most persistent patterns are not primarily stored as narratives. They are stored as somatic states, as nervous system configurations, as implicit memories that live below the threshold of language. They were encoded before the person had the words to describe them. They cannot be fully accessed through words because they don't live in the part of the brain that processes language. This is what van der Kolk kept finding in his clinical work, that patients who understood their trauma with exquisite clarity, who could describe it with precision, who had made sophisticated meaning of it, still had nervous systems that fired as though the trauma were ongoing. The understanding was real. The somatic encoding was untouched. The insight had arrived at the wrong address. This is not a criticism of therapy. It is a description of what therapy alone cannot do, and why the leaders who have done significant therapeutic work and still find themselves stuck in the same patterns are not failing at therapy. They have simply reached the limit of what that particular tool can reach, and they need a different one. The affirmation industry and its ceiling. Alongside therapy, the other primary tool most people reach for when insight fails is some form of positive self programming, affirmations, visualization, cognitive reframing, neuro-linguistic programming, and their many descendants in the personal development space. These approaches share a common logic. If the subconscious mind runs limiting programs, then the solution is to install better programs by repeating new messages with sufficient frequency and emotional intensity that they eventually overwrite the old ones. The logic is not entirely wrong. Repetition does shape neural pathways. Consistent, emotionally engaged practice does create new patterns over time. And for schemas that are relatively recent, relatively mild, or that have not been deeply reinforced by years of lived experience, this approach can produce meaningful results. But for the deep load bearing schemas formed in early childhood, the ones that are held not just in the cognitive mind, but in the nervous system and the body, affirmation hits a ceiling that is well documented and almost universally experienced by anyone who has worked with this population seriously. Here is why. The subconscious mind does not evaluate incoming information the way the conscious mind does. It does not assess an affirmation on its logical merits. It assesses it against existing encoding, against the felt sense of what is true that has been established through years of lived experience. And when the affirmation contradicts that felt sense, the subconscious does not update, it rejects. The person who grew up in an environment of scarcity and conditional love, and who stands in front of the mirror every morning saying, I am enough, I am worthy, I am abundant, is sending a signal that the nervous system recognizes as false, not because the person is unworthy, they are not, but because the signal arriving at the level of felt experience does not match the claim being made at the level of language. The subconscious filters the affirmation out the same way the immune system filters out a pathogen. It has been trained to recognize this particular signal as a mismatch. You cannot talk a nervous system out of what experience has talked it into. An affirmation delivered to a nervous system that knows better is not programming, it is static. The signal never reaches the frequency where the encoding lives, what the locked door actually requires. In my years in the submarine service, we had a protocol for situations where standard procedures had failed and the system remained unresponsive. We didn't keep running the same procedure and hoping for a different result. We identified the level at which the system had failed and intervened at that level. This is the principle that separates approaches that reach the operator from approaches that don't. The question is never whether the intervention is well intentioned or whether it has worked for other people in other circumstances. The question is whether it operates at the level where the problem actually lives. The problem lives at the level of implicit memory, the encoded felt sense of self and world that was established through early experience and stored in the body and the nervous system. It does not live at the level of conscious thought, and it cannot be reached by approaches that operate only at the level of conscious thought. What is required at minimum is access to the state in which the original encoding happened, the emotional and physiological state associated with the formative experience, not to relive it and not to analyze it, but to retrieve the memory in a state that makes the encoding malleable. Because neuroscience has demonstrated something that most personal development practitioners have not yet fully integrated. Memories are not fixed, they are not recordings. Every time a memory is retrieved, it enters a brief window of instability during which the encoding can be altered. That window is the doorway, and the key to that doorway is not insight. It is not willpower. It is not a better habit or a more consistent affirmation practice. It is a specific kind of experience, carefully constructed, delivered in a specific neurological state, designed to reach the level where the original programming was installed and offer the nervous system something it has never had, a genuinely different felt experience of who it is. This is what the next two chapters are about. The science of memory reconsolidation, why memories are rewritable, and what that rewriting actually requires, and the process through which SOS creates the conditions in which that rewriting happens at the level where it needs to happen in a way that holds. The locked door has a key. It just isn't the one most people have been trying. A word about courage. Before we go further, I want to say something that the clinical language of the next chapters can sometimes obscure. What I am describing, the willingness to go to the level where the operator actually lives, to retrieve the original encoding, to allow it to be examined and updated, is not a passive process. It requires something that I have found to be one of the rarest qualities in the leaders I work with, not because they lack it, but because they have spent so long armoring against the need for it. It requires vulnerability, not the performed vulnerability of the leadership seminar, where someone shares a carefully curated moment of struggle to build connection with an audience. Real vulnerability, the willingness to be, for a period of time, genuinely uncertain about who you are, to let the structures that have defined your identity become temporarily unstable, to not know before the process is complete what you will find on the other side. Every leader I have taken through this work has arrived at a moment where the next step required exactly this. And every one of them, without exception, has found that what was on the other side was not what they feared. It was not exposure or dissolution or loss. It was a version of themselves that was, paradoxically, more solid, more grounded, more genuinely confident than the armored version they had been presenting to the world. Because the armor was never the self. It was the operator's solution to a problem that no longer exists. The self, the actual self, underneath the programming, was there the whole time. That's what the rewrite reveals. Chapter 8. Memory is not a recording. For most of human history, we believe that memory worked like a filing cabinet. An experience happens. The brain encodes it. The encoded version gets filed away in long term storage, where it sits, essentially unchanged, until something retrieves it. The retrieval might be imperfect. Details fade, sequences blur, the emotional coloring shifts over time, but the core record, the underlying file, was understood to be stable, fixed, a faithful, if imperfect, archive of what actually happened. This model is wrong, and the implications of its wrongness are, for anyone serious about lasting personal change, among the most important findings in modern neuroscience. Memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. And every time you reconstruct it, you have the opportunity, whether you use it deliberately or not, to change what gets filed back. This is not a metaphor, it is a molecular reality, and understanding it precisely is the foundation on which everything in the next two chapters is built. Every memory you retrieve is temporarily unwritten. What gets stored again afterward is not the original. It is the original plus whatever happened during retrieval. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. The discovery that changed everything. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a series of researchers, most notably Karim Nader, working in the lab of Joseph Ledoux at New York University, made a discovery that the neuroscience establishment initially resisted with considerable force because it contradicted decades of foundational assumption. Nader's experiments, conducted first in rats and subsequently confirmed across multiple species and multiple research groups, demonstrated that when a consolidated memory is retrieved, when it is called up from long-term storage into active working memory, it enters a state of temporary instability. The proteins that hold the memory in place are temporarily destabilized. The memory becomes, for a brief window of time, labile, open to modification, to updating, to being written differently before it is restored. This process is called memory reconsolidation, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most significant findings in neuroscience in the last 30 years. What Nader's team found was that if you administered a protein synthesis inhibitor, a drug that prevented the reformation of the molecular structures that hold memories in place, immediately after a memory was retrieved, the memory was not merely weakened, it was erased. The rat that had previously shown a strong fear response to a particular stimulus showed no response at all, not suppressed, not managed, gone. The memory had been retrieved, destabilized, and then prevented from reconsolidating, and without reconsolidation, there was nothing left to store. Now, we are not going to use protein synthesis inhibitors on leaders. That is not where this is going. But what the pharmacological experiments revealed is a mechanism, a natural biological window that opens every time a memory is retrieved, during which the content of that memory is temporarily rewritable. And that window is accessible not through drugs, but through the right kind of experience delivered in the right neurological state at the right moment in the retrieval process. This is the doorway. This is the mechanism that makes lasting change possible at the level where it actually needs to happen. What gets reconsolidated, and here is where precision matters, because reconsolidation is not a blanket process that applies equally to all memories. It has specific characteristics that determine what can be changed and what cannot. First, reconsolidation is triggered by retrieval. The memory has to be activated, called into working memory, made present in some meaningful sense before the window opens. A memory that remains in long-term storage, never retrieved, never activated, is not available for reconsolidation. This is relevant to the change process because it means the work requires engagement with the material, not avoidance of it. Second, the reconsolidation window is time limited. Research suggests it remains open for somewhere between 1 and 6 hours after retrieval, depending on the nature of the memory and the conditions of retrieval. After that window closes, the memory reconsolidates and gets filed back in its updated form, and the opportunity is passed until the next retrieval. Third, what gets written into the reconsolidated memory is determined by what happens during the window. If nothing meaningful happens, if the memory is retrieved and then simply left to reconsolidate without any new information being introduced, it is filed back largely unchanged, perhaps with minor updating based on current context. But if during the window the person has a genuinely new experience, an experience that introduces information that is incompatible with the core prediction encoded in the original memory, then that new information can be incorporated into what gets filed back. This third point is everything, because what it means is that the most powerful thing you can do with a retrieved memory is not to reframe it cognitively, not to tell yourself a different story about it, not to find the silver lining, not to apply a therapeutic reframe. The most powerful thing you can do is to have a genuinely different felt experience while the memory is active. Not think differently, feel differently at the level of the nervous system, in the body, in the moment. This is the distinction that most personal development approaches miss entirely. And it is the distinction on which the entire SOS methodology is built. The reconsolidation window doesn't care what you think about the memory. It responds to what you feel while the memory is alive. That is the only update it will accept. The mismatch that rewrites. Researchers studying reconsolidation have identified what they call the mismatch signal, the specific experiential condition that most reliably triggers deep reconsolidation rather than simple restabilization. The mismatch is this: the memory predicts one outcome and the experience delivers another, not a verbal contradiction, not a cognitive reframe, an actual felt in the moment experience of something different from what the memory has been predicting. The memory encoded in childhood that says, I am not enough, predicts in situations that activate it a specific emotional and relational outcome: inadequacy, rejection, the withdrawal of approval. When that memory is retrieved, when a situation arises that activates the schema, and the person has, in that activated state, a genuine experience of being seen, valued, and met without conditions, the mismatch between prediction and experience is exactly what the reconsolidation process requires. The nervous system registers the mismatch. The prediction embedded in the memory is temporarily destabilized. And if the new experience is sufficiently real, not imagined, not affirmed, but genuinely felt, it becomes the material from which the reconsolidated memory is rebuilt. The old prediction is not suppressed. It is not managed. It is updated at the molecular level with information that wasn't there before. This is the mechanism, and it is why the work that actually changes the operator feels so different from everything that preceded it. It doesn't feel like insight. It doesn't feel like effort. It feels like something landing, a shift in the felt sense of who you are that is quiet, immediate, and surprisingly ordinary. Leaders who have been through this process often describe the same thing in different words. They say it felt less like a breakthrough and more like a return, like something that was always true had finally been allowed to be true in the body as well as the mind. That description is more neurologically accurate than it sounds. Why hypnotherapy is the right vehicle. At this point, a reasonable question arises. If reconsolidation requires retrieved memory, a regulated nervous system state, and a genuinely mismatching felt experience, how do you create those conditions reliably in a clinical or coaching context for a high performing leader who has spent decades building elaborate defenses against exactly this kind of exposure? The answer, which I came to gradually through my training and practice, is that hypnotherapy, specifically the kind of deep, somatic, state based work that Ryan Fowler has codified in the SOS methodology, is the most reliable vehicle for creating those conditions that I have encountered. Not because hypnotherapy is mysterious, or because it bypasses the person's agency, or because it involves anything that would make the skeptical executives I work with uncomfortable, but because of what it actually does at the neurological level. Hypnosis induces a specific neurological state, characterized by reduced activity in the default mode network, increased focused attention, and a quality of openness and receptivity that researchers have associated with heightened suggestibility in the most precise sense of that word. The nervous system becomes more open to updating its predictions based on new experience. In that state, memory retrieval is both easier and more complete. The somatic components of the memory, the felt sense, the emotional charge, the body level encoding that talk based approaches cannot reach, become accessible. The reconsolidation window opens more fully, and the corrective experience that is introduced during the session is received not as a cognitive proposition to be evaluated, but as a felt reality to be incorporated. This is not magic, it is applied neuroscience. And the results, the kind of results that David experienced, that the leaders in part 4 will describe, are not the gradual incremental improvements of better habit formation. They are the sudden, sometimes disorienting experience of a pattern that has been active for decades simply no longer being active, not suppressed, not managed, rewritten. In the next chapter, we will look at how the SOS process actually works, not as a clinical manual, but as a map of the territory that makes this kind of change possible. Because understanding the process, even from the outside, is part of what prepares the nervous system to engage with it. And after that, we will look at what changes on the other side. That is where this journey has been heading all along. Chapter 9: The Rewrite Process. I want to begin this chapter with something that might seem counterintuitive, given everything that has come before it. The rewrite process is not dramatic. This surprises almost everyone who experiences it for the first time, especially leaders who have arrived expecting something that matches the magnitude of what they are trying to change. They have carried these patterns for decades. The patterns have cost them relationships, opportunities, versions of themselves they can only now begin to imagine. Surely the process that dismantles them should feel proportional to that weight. It usually doesn't. What it feels like more often than not is quiet, a settling, a shift in internal weather that is difficult to describe precisely but unmistakable in its presence. Something that was taught becomes relaxed, something that was loud becomes still. And in the stillness, a quality of clarity that most leaders have not experienced since before they learned that they needed to be on guard. I say this not to diminish what happens in these sessions, but to prepare you for it accurately. Because one of the things the operator does extremely well, right up until it doesn't, is convince you that change of this magnitude must be hard, must be earned through suffering, must feel like breaking something before it can feel like freedom. It doesn't. And the quietness of the shift is part of how you know it is real. Real change at the identity level doesn't feel like a battle. It feels like a door you've been pushing finally opening because someone removed the thing that was holding it shut from the other side. What SOS actually is. The subconscious optimization system was developed by Ryan Fowler over more than 2 decades of clinical practice, research, and refinement. Ryan's background sits at the intersection of clinical hypnotherapy, somatic psychology, and the emerging neuroscience of memory reconsolidation, and the methodology he developed reflects that intersection precisely. SOS is not a single technique. It is a structured process, a sequenced series of interventions designed to create the specific neurological conditions under which deep schema change becomes possible. Each element of the process has a function, and the functions are cumulative. Each one prepares the nervous system for what follows, building toward the moment in which the reconsolidation window opens and the mismatch experience can be delivered at the depth where the original encoding lives. The process works with 3 layers simultaneously: cognitive, somatic, and experiential, because the schema exists at all 3 levels and must be addressed at all 3 levels for the change to be complete. Addressing only the cognitive layer produces insight without transformation. Addressing only the somatic layer produces relief without integration. The full process reaches all 3 and coordinates them in a sequence that the nervous system can receive, process, and incorporate. What I am going to offer in this chapter is not a technical manual. It is a map, a description of the territory through which the process moves, rendered in language that prepares the reader to understand what is happening and why, without reducing it to a set of steps that could be mechanically applied without the clinical foundation that makes them safe and effective. Phase 1: Establishing the ground. Every SOS session begins with what Ryan calls establishing the ground, the creation of a specific neurological state that is distinct from both the hyperactivation of sympathetic arousal and the shutdown of dorsal vagal collapse. In polyvagal terms, this is the ventral vagal state, the state of social engagement, regulated safety, and genuine openness. It is the state in which the nervous system is simultaneously alert and at ease, present without being braced, open without being vulnerable in the dysregulated sense of that word. It is the state that Porges identified as the prerequisite for genuine connection, for real learning, and, critically, for the kind of memory retrieval that allows reconsolidation to occur. For many of the leaders I work with, simply arriving in this state is itself a novel experience. Their nervous systems have been running somewhere between sympathetic activation and managed containment for so long that the ventral vagal state feels unfamiliar, pleasant, but slightly disorienting, like stepping out of a building you've been in for years into unexpectedly warm sunlight. The hypnotic induction that begins each session is designed specifically to guide the nervous system into this state through a combination of focused attention, somatic awareness, and the gradual release of the vigilance that most high performing leaders maintain as their default operating mode. It is not sleep, it is not unconsciousness. It is a specific state of alert, inward focus in which the noise of the thinking mind quiets enough that the deeper layers of the system become accessible. Nothing that happens in a SOS session happens without the client's awareness and participation. The process works with the person, not on them. And the establishment of genuine safety, felt safety, not just intellectual reassurance, is the non negotiable foundation on which everything else is built. Phase 2, mapping the schema. Once the ground is established, the process moves to what I call schema mapping, the careful somatic navigation toward the specific memory or cluster of memories in which the target schema is anchored. This is not the same as telling the story of what happened. It is not a narrative exercise. It is a felt exploration guided by attention to where the body holds the material, what sensations arise as the relevant territory is approached, what emotional weather accompanies the approach. The body, in the regulated state of phase 1, becomes extraordinarily reliable as a guide to where the work needs to go. The schema reveals itself not through what the client says, but through how the client feels as they approach it. There is a recognizable quality to the moment when the right material has been located, a particular quality of activation that is distinct from both calm and distress, a sense of something alive in the system that is neither comfortable nor overwhelming. This is the edge where the work happens, and learning to recognize and work at that edge precisely is one of the core clinical skills that SOS training develops. What emerges in this phase is not always what the client expected to find. The surface schema, the one that shows up in behavior, in pattern, in the 360-degree feedback, is almost never the root. It is a downstream expression of something earlier, something more foundational, something that the system built the surface schema to manage. Finding the root is what makes the rewrite durable. Addressing only the surface is what produces the symptom substitution described in Chapter 5. The pattern you can see is the system's solution to a problem you haven't found yet. The rewrite happens at the level of the problem, not the solution. Phase 3, opening the window. When the root schema has been located, felt, not just identified, the process moves into the phase that is most directly aligned with the neuroscience of reconsolidation. The memory is retrieved, not as a narrative to be analyzed, but as a living experience to be inhabited, briefly, carefully, with the full somatic presence that the regulated state of phase 1 makes possible. The encoding is activated, the felt sense, the emotional charge, the body level experience of what it was like to be the person who originally constructed this schema as a survival strategy. This is the moment that requires the most precise clinical calibration. The memory must be active enough to open the reconsolidation window, present enough in the nervous system that the encoding is genuinely destabilized. But it must not be so overwhelming that the nervous system exits the ventral vagal state and enters defensive activation, because in activation, the window closes and the memory simply reconsolidates in its existing form, potentially more strongly than before. The range within which this work happens is narrow. It requires a practitioner who can read the nervous system in real time, who can track the client's state with precision, and who can calibrate the depth of engagement moment by moment to keep the work in the zone where reconsolidation is possible. When the window is open, when the encoding is active and the nervous system remains regulated, the process introduces the mismatch experience. Phase 4, the mismatch. The mismatch experience is the heart of the SOS process. It is the moment in which the prediction embedded in the original schema, the felt sense of what is true, what is safe, what is possible, what the person deserves, encounters something that it did not predict and cannot accommodate within its existing framework. This is not an intellectual challenge to the schema. It is a felt contradiction delivered at the level of nervous system experience in the precise moment when the encoding is open to revision. The form the mismatch takes varies by the nature of the schema and the specific material being addressed. In some sessions, it is an experience of genuine safety in a context where the schema predicted threat. In others, it is an experience of being fully seen and valued in a context where the schema predicted rejection or inadequacy. In others, still, it is the experience of competence and agency in a context where the schema encoded helplessness. What is consistent across all of them is the quality of the experience. It must be felt, not performed. The nervous system is extraordinarily sensitive to the difference between a genuine corrective experience and a rehearsed one. A practitioner who delivers the mismatch as a technique will produce a different result than one who creates the conditions in which the mismatch becomes a living reality for the client's nervous system. This is why the therapeutic relationship is not incidental to SOS. It is central. The felt experience of being in the presence of someone who sees you clearly, who is not threatened by what they find, and who holds the process with steadiness and genuine care is itself part of the mismatch for many of the leaders I work with. Because that experience of being fully known and fully safe simultaneously is precisely what the schema learned to believe was not available. Phase 5, integration and return. After the mismatch experience, the process moves into what Ryan calls the integration phase, the period in which the nervous system is allowed to complete the reconsolidation process to settle the new information into place and to begin the process of updating the downstream patterns that the original schema was generating. This phase is quieter than what preceded it. It involves a gradual return from the deep inward focus of the session to the ordinary state of present moment awareness with specific attention to grounding in the body, to the felt sense of being here, now, in this body, with this new information incorporated. Leaders often emerge from the integration phase with a quality of presence that is noticeably different from how they arrived. There is a settling in the face, a quality of ease in the body that was not there before, and frequently a kind of mild bewilderment, a sense of having expected something harder, something more dramatic, something more commensurate with the weight of what they've been carrying. What they often say, in various forms, is, "It's gone. The thing I've been fighting for 20 years, it's just not there anymore." Not managed, not reframed, not suppressed beneath a better habit or a more consistent affirmation practice. Gone. Or more precisely, updated, reconsolidated with information that was unavailable to the original encoding, filed back differently, running new code. The operator has been rewritten. What the rewrite is not. Before we move into part 4, I want to be clear about what this process is not, because clarity here matters. The SOS process is not a single session fix for everything. Deep patterns that have been active for decades, that are anchored in multiple layers of encoding, that have generated years of reinforcing experience. These often require multiple sessions, and the integration process continues in the weeks and months after the formal work is done. The nervous system needs time to update downstream from the schema change, to recalibrate the patterns that were built on top of the old encoding, to discover empirically that the new operating code produces different results in the world. The SOS process is also not a substitute for the other work of leadership development. Understanding your patterns, building relational skills, developing strategic clarity, learning to communicate more effectively, all of this remains valuable and necessary. What changes after a rewrite is not that you no longer need to grow. It is that the growth is no longer fighting against a current running in the opposite direction. The operator is no longer generating resistance to the change you are trying to make. And the SOS process is not for everyone in the same way at the same time. Some leaders are not yet ready for this level of work, not because they lack capacity, but because the conditions of safety and genuine willingness that the process requires are not yet in place. Part of the work of preparation is creating those conditions, and sometimes that preparation takes time. What I can tell you, after years of this work with leaders across industries and levels of seniority, is that for the leaders who are ready, the ones who have tried everything else, who understand that the pattern is not a character flaw, but a system error, who are willing to go to the level where the programming actually lives, the results are unlike anything that conventional leadership development produces. Not because the process is more intense, because it is more precise. In part four, you will meet some of those leaders, not through clinical case studies, but through the lived experience of what changes when the operator changes, in the decisions they make, in the teams they build, in the way they inhabit the rooms they walk into. That is where we are going next. Part four, the leader on the other side. What changes when the operator changes? Chapter 10, Different Decisions. David called me on a Tuesday afternoon about 6 weeks after his third SOS session. He was not calling to report a dramatic transformation. He was calling because something had happened in a leadership team meeting that morning, and he didn't quite know what to make of it, and he wanted to talk it through with someone who would understand. His COO, the one who had submitted her resignation twice, had pushed back on a decision David had already made publicly in front of the full leadership team with the particular kind of directness that David had historically experienced as a personal attack disguised as a professional disagreement. David had felt the activation arrive. He recognized it now, the constriction in the chest, the narrowing of focus, the physiological preparation for the kind of response that had, over the years, contributed to two resignation letters and the carefully managed distance his adult children maintained. He felt all of it. And then something different happened. He got curious, not curious in a performed leadership seminar way, not the manufactured openness of someone trying very hard to not do the thing they always do. Genuinely curious. He wanted to know what she saw that he didn't. He asked. She told him. The team watched, visibly uncertain about what was happening, calibrating to a version of David that didn't quite match the one they had learned to navigate. She was right. The decision needed to change. David changed it. He called me because he couldn't figure out where the rage had gone. The decision was the same situation that had always produced the same response. But the person making the decision was different. And different people make different choices, not because they try harder, but because they see differently. The perceptual shift. What David was experiencing, and what almost every leader experiences in the weeks and months following significant schema change, is not primarily a behavioral change. It is a perceptual one. The operator, as we established in part one, does not merely drive behavior, it shapes perception. It determines what the leader notices, what they interpret as threatening, what they read as confirmation of their existing beliefs about themselves and the world. A schema that says, I must be in control to be safe, does not just produce controlling behavior. It produces a perceptual field in which any deviation from the expected creates alarm signals before there is any behavioral response at all. When the schema changes, the perceptual field changes first. David's COO had not changed. The meeting dynamic had not changed. What changed was what David's nervous system registered when she pushed back. The signal that had previously activated a threat response, direct challenge from a competent peer in a context that activated the old control schema, no longer carried the same charge. The neuroception scanned the environment and found something different from what it had always found before. Safety, not because the environment was safer, because the internal state that was reading the environment had been updated. This is the perceptual shift that precedes different decisions. It is not visible from the outside until the decision is made, but from the inside, it is unmistakable. The world looks different when the operator is running different code. The quality of the pause. One of the most consistent things leaders report in the period following SOS work is a change in what I call the quality of the pause, the experience of the moment between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl, writing from the particular authority of someone who had tested this idea in the most extreme conditions imaginable, observed that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies the freedom to choose. He was right. What he could not have known, writing before the era of modern neuroscience, is that the size and quality of that space is not fixed. It is determined, to a very significant degree, by the state of the nervous system in the moment the stimulus arrives. A nervous system running a threat activated schema experiences that space as essentially zero. The stimulus arrives, and the response is already forming before the conscious mind has had time to register what happened. This is why leaders in the grip of a deep schema pattern often describe their reactive behavior as something that happened to them. I don't know where that came from. I couldn't stop it. It was like watching myself from the outside. They are describing the operator taking the wheel so fast that the conscious self didn't have time to intervene. After schema change, that space expands, not because the leader has learned a better technique for managing their response, because the nervous system is no longer preloading the defensive reaction before the moment arrives. The pause becomes real, the choice that Frankl described becomes available, and the decisions made from that space are categorically different from the ones made in its absence. They are not better decisions because the leader is trying harder. They are better decisions because the leader is seeing more clearly, because the perceptual filter has been updated, because the person sitting in that chair is, in a meaningful neurological sense, a different person than the one who sat there before. What changes in the decisions themselves? The changes in decision quality that follow schema work are not random. They cluster in predictable areas because they are the downstream effects of specific schema changes, the places where the old encoding was most actively distorting the leader's perception and response. Leaders who completed work around control schemas consistently report a shift in how they relate to uncertainty. Where uncertainty previously activated a compulsion to foreclose options, to push for premature resolution, to make a decision, any decision, rather than sit with not knowing, the post rewrite experience is one of being able to hold complexity open longer, to let the situation develop, to gather more information before committing. This produces better strategic decisions because the decisions are no longer being driven by the nervous system's need to reduce threat. They are being driven by the actual requirements of the situation. Leaders who completed work around inadequacy schemas report a shift in how they relate to other people's competence. Where the competence of a team member previously activated a subtle competitive dynamic, a need to reassert superiority, to find the flaw, to qualify the accomplishment, the post rewrite experience is one of genuine satisfaction, of being able to celebrate without the celebration costing something. This produces better talent decisions because the leader is no longer unconsciously selecting for people who won't threaten the schema. Leaders who completed work around abandonment or rejection schemas report a shift in how they navigate difficult conversations. Where the anticipation of conflict previously activated avoidance strategies, delayed conversations, vague feedback, the diplomatic evasiveness that direct reports experience as maddening and demoralizing, the post rewrite experience is one of being able to enter hard conversations without the body bracing for loss. The conversation becomes about the issue, not about survival. In each case, the change is not the leader becoming a different type of personality. It is the leader becoming a more fully realized version of their actual self, freed from the distortions that the operator's outdated programming was introducing into every room they walked into. The leader on the other side of this work is not a transformed person. They are a revealed one, the person they always were, before the schema convinced them otherwise. The decisions nobody talks about. There is a category of decision change that almost never makes it into the leadership literature because it doesn't fit neatly into the language of professional development. But it is, in my experience, often the most significant indicator that real schema change has occurred. It is the decision to stop performing, to stop managing impressions, to stop the particular brand of exhausting vigilance that the operator requires of leaders who are running protection schemas, the constant scanning for threat, the careful calibration of self presentation, the energy spent ensuring that the version of themselves that the world sees is not the version that the schema says is unacceptable. When the schema changes, the performance becomes optional. And most leaders, given the option, discover that they don't want to perform anymore, not because they have abandoned professionalism or self awareness, but because the distinction between the performing self and the actual self has collapsed. They are the same person in the board meeting and in the car afterward, the same person with their team and with their family, the same person when things are going well and when they are not. This integration, the felt sense of being one person across contexts rather than a collection of carefully managed presentations, is one of the most reported outcomes of significant schema change. And it is, for the leaders who experience it, often more valuable than any specific improvement in decision quality because the energy that was going into the performance is now available for everything else, for the work, for the relationships, for the version of leadership that the leader always knew was possible but could never quite reach, not because they lacked the skill, but because too much of their available capacity was being consumed by the operator's endless maintenance requirements. That energy doesn't come back gradually. It comes back all at once. And what leaders do with it in the months that follow is often the most interesting part of the story. Chapter 11. The team feels it first. Before David noticed the change in his own behavior, his team noticed it. This is almost always how it goes. The leader experiences the internal shift, the expanded pause, the perceptual change, the quiet absence of the activation they'd spent years managing, but the internal experience is invisible to everyone else. What is not invisible is what the internal change produces in behavior, in tone, in the quality of presence a leader brings into a room. The team reads that quality before they have words for it. They feel it in the body, in the subtle recalibration of their own nervous systems in response to what the leader's nervous system is now broadcasting. And what they feel determines, more than any strategic initiative or culture program ever could, what they are capable of doing together. David's COO told him something about 3 months after the shift became visible that he later shared with me. She said, "I don't know what you did, but for the first time in 9 years, I actually want to come to work on Monday. Not because the work changed, because you changed. And I didn't realize until you changed how much energy I was spending bracing for who you used to be." That sentence carries more organizational intelligence than most culture audits. Culture is not what a leader declares. It is what a leader's nervous system broadcasts, and what every other nervous system in the organization learns to adapt to in response. The nervous system is contagious. The scientific basis for what David's COO experienced has a name: co regulation, and it is one of the most underappreciated mechanisms in organizational psychology. Co regulation is the process by which one nervous system influences the state of another through proximity, relationship, and the continuous exchange of social signals: vocal tone, facial expression, posture, timing, breath, and the thousand other micro cues that the human nervous system reads automatically and continuously in the presence of other people. It is the mechanism through which a mother's regulated nervous system soothes an infant. It is the mechanism through which a calm commander steadies a rattled crew. and it is the mechanism through which a leader's dysregulated nervous system, one running high activation threat responses as its default mode, keeps an entire organization in a chronic state of low grade alarm. Porges's polyvagal theory, which we explored in Chapter 6, provides the precise neurological account of how this works. The social engagement system, the ventral vagal state that allows for genuine connection, creativity, and collaborative problem solving, is activated and sustained in part through co regulatory signals from other people. When those signals communicate safety, the nervous system can access its full range of capacities. When they communicate threat, even subtle, ambient, low level threat of the kind that a controlling or volatile leader generates, the nervous system shifts towards self protection and the capacities associated with the social engagement system become less available. What this means in organizational terms is stark. A team that is chronically co regulated toward a threat state by their leader's nervous system is a team that is operating at a fraction of its potential. Not because the people lack talent, not because the strategy is wrong, not because the culture program hasn't been resourced properly, because the most fundamental signal in their environment is telling them continuously and below the level of conscious awareness that this is not a safe place to think freely, take risks, or show up fully. No amount of psychological safety training overrides what the leader's nervous system is broadcasting in real time, what the team was actually managing. When I work with leadership teams in the aftermath of a leader's schema change, one of the most consistent findings is the revelation of how much organizational energy had been devoted, invisibly, to managing the leader's operator. Every team develops over time a sophisticated and largely unconscious system for navigating the leader's patterns. They learn which topics activate the defensive response and which can be raised safely. They learn the timing, which days, which times of day, which states of mind make the leader more or less accessible. They learn which members of the team have more influence in which circumstances, and they route sensitive communications accordingly. They develop a shared, unspoken language for the warning signals that precede the patterns everyone is trying to avoid. This is not disloyalty, it is adaptation, the same adaptation that children develop in response to an unpredictable or volatile caregiver. It is intelligent, it is functional, and it consumes an extraordinary amount of cognitive and emotional bandwidth that could otherwise be directed at the actual work. In organizational psychology, this is sometimes called the leader's shadow, the downstream behavioral adaptations that the organization generates in response to the leader's patterns. The shadow is rarely discussed openly because discussing it openly would require acknowledging things about the leader that the organizational culture has agreed implicitly not to name. But the shadow is visible in every culture survey that returns results clustering around themes of fear, unpredictability, or the sense that it isn't safe to speak up. Those results are not about the organization, they are about the operator at the top. When the operator changes, the shadow changes, and the energy that the organization was spending on shadow management becomes available for something else. Every hour your team spends managing your operator is an hour they are not spending on the work. That calculation runs every day, invisibly, on every team you will ever lead. The adjustment period. Here is something that surprises many leaders and that I make a point of preparing them for. When the operator changes, the team does not immediately respond with relief and flourishing. There is almost always an adjustment period that precedes that, and it can be disorienting for everyone involved. Teams that have been organized around a leader's patterns, that have developed sophisticated systems for navigating those patterns, experience a period of genuine uncertainty when the patterns change. The maps they have been using no longer match the territory. The adaptations they developed are no longer necessary, but they don't know that yet because the nervous system requires time to update its threat assessment when the environmental signals change. David's team went through approximately 6 weeks of what he described with some amusement as collective bewilderment. They kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. They were careful in ways that were no longer necessary, restrained in ways that the new David actively wanted them to release. It took time and explicit, consistent, embodied demonstration that the change was real and not a new performance before the co regulatory signal registered as safe enough to update. This is normal. It is part of the process, and it requires a particular kind of patience from the leader, not the performance of patience, which the team will read immediately as exactly that, but the genuine article, the settled, unhurried confidence of someone who knows they have changed and is willing to let the evidence accumulate at whatever pace the team's nervous systems require. The leaders who navigate this adjustment period most successfully are the ones who do not try to manage the team's response to their change. They simply continue to be the updated version of themselves, consistently and without fanfare, and allow the team's nervous systems to catch up on their own timeline. The team always catches up. And when they do, what becomes possible organizationally is something that no culture initiative, no engagement survey, and no leadership development program could have produced from the outside. What becomes possible? I want to close this chapter with something that is difficult to convey through description, but that every leader who has been through this work would recognize immediately. There is a quality of team engagement that becomes possible, and only becomes possible, when the leader's nervous system is genuinely regulated, not managed, not performing regulation, actually regulated from the inside because the schema that was generating the dysregulation has been updated at the source. In that quality of engagement, things happen that don't happen in teams operating under the shadow of an unaddressed operator. People say the true thing even when the true thing is uncomfortable. Problems surface early when they are still manageable rather than late when they have become crises. Disagreement is generative rather than threatening. The team thinks together in ways that no individual in the room could think alone. This is not an aspirational description of what great teams can be. It is a description of what teams actually become, reliably and consistently, when the nervous system broadcasting at the top of the system changes from threat to safety. The organizational literature calls this psychological safety, and it is right that it matters. What the literature doesn't fully account for is that psychological safety is not primarily a structural feature of an organization. It is a nervous system state, one that is generated, sustained, and most powerfully transmitted by the person whose nervous system has the most influence on everyone else's. That person is the leader. And the most powerful thing any leader can do for the psychological safety of their team is not to read another book about it, or implement another survey, or hire another consultant to run another workshop. It is to do the work of understanding and updating the operator that their team has been adapting to, navigating around, and quietly absorbing the cost of, often for years. The team feels it first, and what they feel when the operator changes is something they will remember for the rest of their careers. It feels like being allowed to do their best work. Chapter 12. The Question Answered. We began this book with a question, not a rhetorical one, a real one, the kind that has kept more than a few accomplished leaders awake at 2 a.m., wondering why they keep getting in their own way despite knowing better, trying harder, and caring deeply about the outcome. Who's actually running this? You know the answer now, not as a concept, as something you've understood from the inside out, layer by layer, through the neuroscience and the clinical evidence and the stories of leaders who have stood exactly where you are standing and discovered what was waiting on the other side of the work. The operator has been running this, the subconscious identity assembled in childhood from the raw materials of your earliest experiences, the emotional climate of your family, the moments of connection and rupture, the things that were safe to be and the things that weren't. The operating system installed before you had any say in its contents, running 95% of your behavior while you believed you were making conscious choices. The thing that has been in the room with you in every hard conversation, every significant decision, every relationship that followed a pattern you couldn't quite escape no matter how clearly you saw it. The operator, not you, and that distinction between the operator and the self is not a small one. It is, in my experience, one of the most liberating recognitions available to a human being. Because the moment you understand that the pattern is not a character verdict, that it is a system output, that it was built to protect you rather than to limit you and has simply outlived the threat it was built to address. The moment that lands in the body and not just the mind, something shifts in the way you hold the whole question of who you are. You are not the operator. You never were. You are the person the operator was built to protect, and you have been there, waiting the entire time. How you'll know. There is a practical question that most leaders arrive at by this point in the book, and it deserves a direct answer. How will I know when the operator has actually changed, not just when I'm managing it better, but when the code itself has been rewritten? The answer is both simpler and more specific than most people expect. You will know because the activation doesn't come, not because you caught it and redirected it, not because you applied a technique or remembered a framework in the critical moment, because the signal that used to fire, the threat alert, the defensive preparation, the physiological bracing that preceded the reactive behavior simply isn't there. The situation that used to be charged is now neutral, not reframed as neutral. Actually, neutral. The nervous system has updated its assessment, and the old alarm has no trigger to pull. You will know because your perception has changed. The room looks different. The people in it seem less threatening, less competitive, less potentially abandoning than they did before. Not because the room changed, because the filter through which you are reading it has been updated. You will know because the decisions come from a different place. There is a quality of groundedness in post rewrite decision making that is difficult to articulate but unmistakable in experience, a sense of choosing from genuine preference rather than from fear of the alternative, of acting from values rather than from the operator's threat management protocols. And you will know, perhaps most clearly, because the people closest to you will tell you in one way or another that something has changed. Your team, your partner, the people who have been navigating around a version of you that you didn't fully know was there. They will feel the change before they can name it. And when they name it, it will be the most honest feedback you have ever received because it will be coming from their nervous systems rather than their social calculations. The work that remains. I want to be honest about something as we approach the end of this book. Reading these pages is not the same as doing the work. Understanding the operator is not the same as updating it. The map is not the territory, and the description of the rewrite process is not the rewrite. What this book can do, what I hope it has done, is change the quality of your readiness. Not readiness as a performance or a resolve, but genuine readiness, the settled, embodied sense of a person who understands what they are dealing with precisely enough to engage with it effectively, who has released the false belief that they should have been able to think or try their way out of it, and who is no longer willing to spend another decade managing the operator's outputs when the operator itself can be addressed. That readiness is not nothing. In my experience, it is the most important prerequisite for the work that follows. Because the SOS process requires a specific quality of willingness, not the willingness of desperation or of someone who has simply run out of other options, but the willingness of someone who genuinely understands what they are walking toward and has decided that the version of themselves on the other side of it is worth the vulnerability the journey requires. If you are in that place, if this book has brought you to that place, then the next step is clear. It is to find a practitioner equipped to do this work at the level where it needs to be done and to begin. Information about how to connect with Costello leadership, explore subconscious operating system work, and access the resources referenced throughout this book is available in the section that follows. I offer it not as a sales pitch, but as a practical bridge, because a book that builds this level of understanding and then leaves the reader without a path forward would be, in the most precise sense, incomplete. A final word about the submarine. I return at the end of this book to where I began my adult life, 200 feet below the surface of the ocean, in a machine that was one of the most complex and unforgiving environments ever created by human hands. In the submarine service, there was a quality that distinguished the exceptional leaders from the merely competent ones. It was not strategic intelligence, though the best had that in abundance. It was not technical mastery, though you couldn't function without it. It was not even courage in the conventional sense, though the work required it daily. It was self knowledge of a particular and precise kind. The awareness of how you performed under pressure, not how you intended to perform, not how you had performed in training, but how your actual nervous system in actual high stakes conditions under actual sustained stress actually behaved. Because in that environment, a leader who did not know their own responses with precision was a liability. The boat had no tolerance for the gap between who a leader believed they were and who they actually were when it mattered. Leadership on the surface is more forgiving. The consequences of the gap between the performed self and the actual self accumulate more slowly, and the environment absorbs more variance. But the gap is still there. And the cost of it, to the teams who navigate around it, to the organizations that build cultures around it, to the leaders themselves who spend decades managing it, is real, even when it is invisible. This book has been an attempt to make that gap visible, to name what lives in it, and to offer a path toward closing it, not through better management of the distance between who you are and who you want to be, but through the actual reduction of that distance at the level where it was created. The submarine doesn't care what you think you know, the boat responds to what you actually are. So does your team. So do your relationships. So does every room you walk into where the outcome matters. Now, you know what's actually been running this. The question is what you do with that knowledge. The most important leadership decision you will ever make is not strategic. It is this one, to find out who is actually running this and then to meet them and change them at the level where change actually lasts. Conclusion: the only leadership development that lasts. The leadership development industry generates approximately $40 billion annually. It produces an enormous volume of frameworks, assessments, workshops, coaching engagements, keynotes, and books. This one among them, all directed at a single question: how do you make leaders better? The question is the right one. The answer the industry most commonly provides is not, because the answer most commonly provided operates at the level of behavior, of skill acquisition, habit formation, mindset shift, and the development of new competencies layered on top of existing ones. And for a certain category of leadership challenge, this is exactly right. Not every leadership limitation is rooted in deep schema. Not every pattern requires reconsolidation work to change. Some things genuinely do respond to better frameworks, clearer feedback, and more consistent practice. But for the category of challenge that this book has been written about, the patterns that survive insight, that outlast willpower, that resist every conventional developmental approach, behavioral intervention is the wrong level. And spending 40 years and $40 billion at the wrong level is not leadership development. It is leadership maintenance. Maintenance has its place, but it is not transformation. The only leadership development that lasts is the kind that reaches the level where the patterns actually live, in the nervous system, in the encoded memory, in the subconscious identity that was assembled before the leader had any say in its contents. Everything else is surface work, genuinely valuable but ultimately limited by the depth of its reach. Surface work produces surface change. The leaders who transform, not just improve, but genuinely transform, are the ones who found a way to go all the way down. I have watched this kind of change happen across years of clinical practice and executive work. I have sat with founders who built companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars and couldn't maintain a peer relationship without it turning competitive. With veterans who carried the discipline and the capability to run almost anything and couldn't translate that capacity into the civilian leadership environments where their skills were desperately needed. With leaders at every level of organizational life who were, by every external measure, successful, and who knew, with the particular clarity that genuine self awareness produces, that they were operating at a fraction of what they were capable of. The work I have described in this book changed those leaders, not incrementally, not through the gradual accumulation of better habits and clearer frameworks, but at the level of identity, the level where the operator lives, where the original programming was installed, where the rewrite, when it happens, is permanent. That is what lasting leadership development looks like. It is not comfortable. It is not quick. It requires a quality of courage that is different from the courage most leaders have been rewarded for. Not the courage of pushing through, but the courage of going in. But it works at a depth that nothing else reaches, and in a way that holds. The question that opened this book deserves, at its close, a different kind of answer than the one we started with. Who's actually running this? After the work, after the real work, the work that reaches all the way down, the answer changes. You are. Finally, fully, from the inside out, you. Author's note. I spent 12 years as a missile technician aboard nuclear submarines, and the discipline of that environment shaped everything that came after it. It taught me that systems are only as reliable as their deepest components, that the distance between understanding a problem and fixing it is the distance between the conscious mind and the place where the problem actually lives, and that the leaders who are most dangerous are not the ones who lack capability. They are the ones who lack the self-knowledge to understand how their own system is functioning under pressure. I carried those lessons through a career in enterprise technology leadership into the clinical training that made me a certified hypnotherapist and SOS practitioner, and into the executive coaching work that has been the primary focus of Costello leadership for the past 3 years. The subconscious optimization system was developed by Ryan Fowler, whose 20 plus years of clinical research and refinement produced the most precisely calibrated methodology for deep identity change that I have encountered in any field. I am a certified SOS practitioner and a committed advocate for the work because I have seen what it does in sessions, in the weeks and months that follow, and in the lives and leadership of the people who have been willing to go there. This book exists because the question at its center, who's actually running this, is one that I have never been able to stop asking. And because the leaders I have had the privilege of working with deserve an answer that is honest about the depth of the problem and equally honest about the depth of the solution. If this book has moved something in you, I want to know about it. And if you are ready for the work that comes next, I am here for that conversation. Tim Costello, Sun City, Arizona, www.costelloleadership.com, tim@costelloleadership.com. Resources and next steps. The ideas in this book are a starting point. What follows is where the work begins. Costello Leadership, executive coaching, SOS sessions, keynote speaking, and organizational consulting. If you are ready to explore what schema level change looks like for your specific situation, this is where to begin the conversation. Keynote speaking. Tim Costello is available for keynote presentations on the themes explored in this book, including Who's Actually Running This? And Built from the Inside, the neuroscience of emotional intelligence for high-performing leaders. For speaking inquiries, visit the website above or reach out directly. Further reading, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Atomic Habits by James Clear. The Biology of Belief by Bruce Lipton. Polyvagal Theory in Therapy by Deb Dana. In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts by Gabor Mate. Built from the Inside by Tim Costello with Ryan Fowler. Built from Within by Tim Costello with Ryan Fowler.